Hello everyone, and welcome back to 3 AM Archives, where darkness meets tranquility. I know many of you use these videos to sleep, but before you drift off, I'd love to know which corner of the world you're listening from. Feel free to share in the comments. If these tales help ease you into slumber, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, dim your lights, find your most comfortable position, and let's begin. Something woke me at 3:17 a.m. I knew the exact time because I'd been checking my watch obsessively since setting up camp, counting the hours since Melissa had signed those final papers. The nylon walls of my tent rippled in a breeze that shouldn't have existed on such a still night. That's when I noticed the smell. Wood smoke, fresh and thick, drifting through the mesh ventilation panels. I hadn't lit a fire that night. I was certain of it. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached for my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a thin ribbon of smoke rising from a pit I didn't remember digging. The embers pulsed like dying stars, casting just enough light to reveal a circle of stones arranged around the ashes. Perfect geometry. Too perfect. I hadn't arranged any stones. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond my camp. I swung the beam toward the sound, but the light seemed to stop short, as if the darkness had substance, weight, purpose. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat cross-legged in my tent, listening to the woods breathe around me. The divorce had left me raw, exposed, but this was different. This feeling of being watched, studied, stalked. It crawled across my skin like ice water. Dawn arrived with cruel slowness. When I finally unzipped the tent, the morning dew had already soaked through everything, including a piece of paper tucked into my left boot. The handwriting was familiar. Too familiar. "Don't sleep here tonight." I crumpled the note, trying to laugh it off as a prank, but my hand was shaking. That's when I noticed the other details. Food scraps by the fire pit, eggs and bacon I hadn't packed, muddy footprints leading to and from my tent, my size 11 hiking boots. The birds had gone quiet. In the distance, something scraped against wood, like claws, or maybe fingernails, dragging slowly down a tree trunk. I fumbled for my camera, needing to document this, to prove to myself I wasn't losing it. The screen flickered to life and my stomach dropped. The photo roll was full. Dozens of images I didn't remember taking, my empty tent from different angles, the campsite at night, and most disturbing of all, a dark figure standing just at the edge of the frame, watching my sleeping form through the tent mesh. The figure wore my red flannel shirt. A wave of vertigo hit me as I scrolled through the photos. Each one was time-stamped from the past 3 days, but I'd only arrived yesterday. Hadn't I? The images grew more disturbing. Close-ups of my tent while I slept, taken from inside the camp. Shots of my own face, unconscious, from angles that seemed impossible. The scratching sound came again, closer now. I spun toward it, nearly dropping the camera. 20 yards away, a tree bore fresh marks in its bark. Not from an animal. These were deliberate. A crude arrow pointing deeper into the woods. Below it, more marks. Follow. "Like hell," I whispered, but my feet were already moving. The morning mist clung to the ground like something alive, curling around my ankles as I walked. The woods seemed wrong somehow. Too dense, too quiet. The sun should have been higher by now, but the light remained gray, diffused. That's when I found the second campsite. Everything was identical to mine. The same tent, same gear arrangement, same brand of protein bars scattered around a cold fire pit. But the tags on the tent were more weathered, the ashes more settled. A note was pinned to the canvas with my Swiss Army knife. "Get out before dark. They're getting closer." They? My mouth went dry. I turned to retreat to my own camp, but stopped short. Through the trees, I could see a third campsite, and a fourth, each one a perfect mirror of mine, each in a different stage of abandonment. The camera felt heavy in my hand. I raised it with trembling fingers and clicked through to the most recent photos. The timestamp read 3:17 a.m. just hours ago. The image showed me sleeping, but something was wrong with my face. The features were twisted, distorted, like a photo negative of myself. The next image made my blood freeze. I was standing over my own sleeping form, grinning at the camera. A branch cracked behind me. The scratching sound returned, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a low, wet chuckle that I recognized as my own laugh. I ran. The sound of my footsteps echoed strangely, as if multiple people were running in different directions. The mist thickened, turning the woods into a maze of gray shadows. Every time I thought I'd found my way back to my original camp, I'd stumble upon another replica, each one more disturbing than the last. The fifth sight stopped me cold. The tent was shredded, as if someone had clawed their way out from inside. A journal lay open beside the destroyed shelter, its pages filled with my handwriting, but the entries made no sense. Day 4. The reflections are wrong. They move when I don't. Day 7. I keep waking up in different clothes, different times, different me. Day 12. Melissa was right. I'm fragmenting, splitting, multiplying. Memory hit me like a physical blow. Melissa's voice trembling during our last fight. You disappeared for 3 days last month. When you came back, you claimed you'd been home the whole time. You screamed at me for lying. But I had photos, Jack. Security camera footage. You were in Cincinnati, living another life. The scratching sound surrounded me now, coming from every direction. In the distance, I heard multiple voices, all mine, calling out in different tones, different inflections. The mist parted, revealing a small lake I hadn't noticed before. As I approached the water's edge, my reflection showed me standing perfectly still, but I was moving. The reflection grinned, a twisted, feral version of my own smile. Behind it, I could see other versions of myself emerging from the mist, each one slightly different, each one wrong in its own unique way. They moved closer, reaching out with hands that bore my scars but weren't mine. We've been waiting, they said in unison, waiting for you to finally see us. My watch beeped, 3:17 a.m., but it was daylight, wasn't it? The sky darkened as if someone were dimming a switch. The water's surface turned black, reflecting nothing now except my own fractured psyche, multiplied infinitely in its depths. The journal entries, the photos, the lost time. It all made terrible sense as my memories crashed back like a broken dam. I wasn't being stalked. I was the stalker. Each version of me had been watching the others, documenting, warning, trying to break the cycle. The fugue states hadn't just been blackouts. They'd been complete personality shifts, each one setting up camp, each one leaving warnings for the others. A hand gripped my shoulder, my hand, but attached to another me. This version's eyes were hollow, desperate. We have to end this, it whispered, before we multiply again, before we lose what's left of who we are. More versions emerged from the mist. The angry one wearing the clothes from my last fight with Melissa. The confused one still believing he'd just arrived. The dangerous one whose smile promised violence. All me, all real. My head split with remembered fragments. Waking up in strange cities, Melissa's tears, the therapist's warnings about dissociative episodes. Fugue states can create entire alternate personalities, she'd said. Each one real, each one fighting for control. The lake's surface began to bubble and churn. In its depths, I saw more versions forming, waiting to emerge. The cycle would continue, endless iterations of my fractured self, unless... I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and dialed Dr. Jensen's number. The other versions of me lunged forward, trying to stop me, but the original me, the one who'd first set up camp, held them back. Dr. Jensen? I'm at Cotter's Lake Campground. My voice cracked as the others screamed in protest. I need help. We need help. All of us. Jack? Her voice was cautious, hopeful. Are you ready to talk about the lost time? Yes, we said in unison, our voices merging into one as the truth finally broke through. I'm ready to meet myself. The sun began to rise, burning away the mist. As red light touched the lake's surface, I watched my reflections begin to merge, each version collapsing back into me like waves returning to a troubled sea. The horror wasn't ending, it was only beginning. But at least now I knew what I was fighting. I wasn't alone in these woods. I never had been. The monster and the victim were the same person, and that person was me. Dr. Jensen's voice anchored me to reality. Stay where you are, Jack. I'm coming with help. Just stay who you are right now. Can you do that? I looked at my watch one last time. 3:17 a.m. Behind me, I heard the others laugh. I don't know, I whispered, but I'm going to try.
My flashlight beam slashed through darkness, catching fragments of trees, undergrowth, my own ragged breath clouding in the cold. Something crashed through the forest behind me. Not an animal. Animals didn't whistle that song, our song, in perfect pitch. My mind traveled back to what had happened only 8 hours earlier. The tent stakes bit into hard earth as I hammered them down, each metallic ping echoing through pristine wilderness. Caleb would have laughed at my technique. "You're not trying to wake the dead, Fina," he would have said. But Caleb wasn't here to critique my camping skills anymore. I chose this spot despite everything, or maybe because of everything. The new reservoir created by the dam had flooded the original site miles downstream. But up here, where we'd started that last hike, everything remained untouched. My therapist would call this self-destructive pattern seeking. The park rangers would call it dangerous. I called it necessary. After a year of wondering, of rewinding that night in my head, I needed to face this place. Besides, the autumn air carried that sharp edge that Caleb loved, clean enough to slice through city memories and the fog of guilt I'd been living in. When the tent was up, I sat on a fallen log and pulled out his old compass. Not the real one. That one was buried with him. This was just a replica, a stupid novelty shop purchase that looked similar enough to make my chest ache. The needle spun lazily, refusing to settle. Night fell like a heavy curtain. The first scratch came at 2 a.m., dragging along the tent's outer shell. I froze in my sleeping bag, heart thundering against my ribs. Another scratch, deliberate and slow, followed by a sound that stopped my breath entirely. The distinct click of Caleb's compass opening. But that was impossible. The replica was in my backpack. I fumbled for my flashlight. The beam caught something metallic glinting at the tent's entrance. Caleb's actual compass, the one we'd buried with him, lay there, its aged brass case collecting moonlight like water. Temperature plummeted. Outside, branches snapped under heavy footsteps, and a familiar whistle pierced the night. The first bars of Brown-Eyed Girl, hideously off-key, just like Caleb used to do it. "No," I whispered, pressing my hands against my ears. "You're not here. You can't be here." The whistling stopped. Then, his voice, rough with river water. "Why didn't you hold on, Serafina?" I screamed. The tent collapsed around me as I scrambled out, fighting nylon and panic. The compass was gone, but the air still carried that metallic taste of river water. My hands shook as I swept the flashlight beam across the campsite. Nothing moved except shadows cast by branches against the fat harvest moon. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around. "Hello?" My voice sounded thin, childish. A man stood at the edge of my camp, wearing hiking gear and an apologetic smile. His headlamp cast strange shadows across his face. "Sorry to startle you," he said. "Heard screaming. You okay?" Relief flooded through me. Just another camper. Normal. Real. Though something about his gear looked oddly dated. The kind of equipment REI sold maybe 5 years ago. "I'm fine," I managed. "Just thought I heard something." He nodded, taking a step closer. The beam of his headlamp never seemed to quite illuminate his face properly. "Gets pretty wild out here at night. You're brave, camping alone." His smile widened slightly. "Most folks wouldn't, especially after what happened last year." I felt the first tendril of unease. The casual way he said it, like testing waters. "What do you mean?" "The drowning," he said. His voice had changed subtly, less resonant, like it was coming from somewhere deeper than his throat. Guy tried to save his girlfriend during that flash flood. They only found one body. He pointed toward the river. Down there. My throat closed up. That wasn't how it happened. That wasn't... The man took another step forward, and his headlamp flickered. In that stuttering light, I saw that his hiking boots were leaving wet prints on dry ground. "They got it backward," I whispered. The hiker's head tilted at an impossible angle, and his headlamp died completely. "Did they, Serafina?" I ran. The forest swallowed my frantic footsteps, branches whipping my face. I had to reach the car, had to get out. But each path I took led to familiar landmarks that shouldn't exist. The lightning-struck oak where Caleb had carved our initials, the moss-covered boulder where we'd shared our last lunch. I stumbled into a clearing and stopped dead. Moonlight illuminated a campsite, our campsite, from that night. The tent was there, rain-soaked and collapsed. The same red cooler lay overturned, its contents scattered. Even the remains of our fire, long cold, sketched a black circle in the dirt. But this place was underwater now. The dam had made sure of that. Static crackled from my backpack. I hadn't packed a radio, but I heard it anyway. Van Morrison's voice fighting through waves of interference. Our song. The one that had been playing in the car when we first kissed, when Caleb's laugh turned nervous and his hands shook as he leaned in. "Stop it," I whispered, but the memory came anyway. Rain hammering the tent, the emergency alert on our phones. Caleb's voice. "We need to move now." The roar of water as the river broke its banks, his hand gripping mine as we ran. The rescue helicopter's spotlight catching us on that cliff edge, the rope dropping down. "You let go." His voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "You let go first." "I didn't mean to," I screamed into the darkness. "The current, it was too strong." "You chose." Wet footsteps circled behind me. One hand holding mine, one hand reaching for the rope. "You chose." I spun around and there he was. Caleb, looking exactly as he had that night. Soaked flannel shirt, mud-streaked face, eyes reflecting nothing but black water. The thing wearing Caleb's face smiled, gentle and terrible. That's all I needed to hear. He reached for me. I stepped back reflexively, into empty air. I fell, just like before. But this time there was no rope, no helicopter, nothing but the rushing dark below. My back slammed into something solid. Earth, not water. I'd fallen only a few feet, onto a natural ledge just below the cliff edge. Above me, Caleb, or whatever it was, looked down, his outline already fading like mist. "You chose life," he said softly. "Stop punishing yourself for it." When I finally managed to climb back up, the forest was just a forest, the night just a night. My flashlight beam caught something in the grass. Caleb's compass, the real one. The needle pointed firmly north. I walked back to my campsite as dawn broke. My tent stood exactly as I'd left it. No collapse, no signs of the night's terror. Everything looked normal, rational, explainable. But when I got home 3 days later, exhausted and changed, I found a note on my pillow in familiar handwriting. "I would have wanted you to let go. See. The compass sits in my desk drawer now. I don't need to look at it anymore to know which way to go."
I shouldn't have climbed this high. The fog rolled beneath my campsite like a living thing, consuming the valley and everything in it. My phone displayed the same mocking message it had for the past hour. No service. Fitting, really. I'd come here to escape. From the deadline. From Marcus's increasingly threatening voicemails. From the crushing weight of a blank page where my next hit song should be. The tent went up as darkness crept in. I kept glancing at the stone cairn near the cliff's edge, though I couldn't say why. It looked fresh, each stone carefully balanced, but this far up the trail, that made no sense. No one had been here in weeks, according to the log at the ranger station. As I unpacked my guitar, Marcus's last message played in my head. 2 weeks, James. That's all you've got. Then we pull the contract, and you can kiss your career goodbye. My fingers traced the worn fretboard, searching for inspiration that wouldn't come. Night fell like a curtain. The temperature dropped, and the wind picked up, carrying sounds that might have been voices, if I let myself think about it too long. I huddled in my sleeping bag, notepad empty beside me, and eventually drifted off. The singing woke me at 3:17 a.m. At first, I thought I was dreaming. A woman's voice, crystal clear and hauntingly beautiful, floated up from the fog-shrouded valley. The melody was unlike anything I'd ever heard, ancient and new all at once, with harmonies that made my chest ache. I scrambled for my phone, hands shaking as I opened the recording app. The singing stopped. "No, no, no," I whispered, crawling to the tent's entrance. The fog had crept higher, almost reaching my campsite. In the moonlight, I could have sworn the cairn had shifted, angled differently than before, but that was impossible. When dawn broke, I examined my guitar and froze. Carved into the wood near the bridge were symbols I'd never seen before, delicate spirals and sharp angles that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I ran my fingers over the marks, and the melody from my dream, it had to be a dream, played in my head. That's when it all began. That's when I should have packed up and left this cursed mountaintop. But the song, God, the song was everything I'd been searching for. I didn't know then that it was searching for me too. The second night changed everything. The singing returned, stronger now, and I was ready. My hands flew across the guitar strings, matching the ethereal vocals note for note. The melody poured out of me like it had always been there, waiting. In the valley below, the fog swirled in patterns that matched the rhythm. I dozed off while writing, the notebook filled with more music than I'd composed in months. In my dreams, dark figures moved through mist, their limbs too long, their movements too fluid. They reached for me with fingers like smoky tendrils, and a voice, her voice, whispered words I couldn't understand but somehow knew. I jolted awake, drenched in sweat. The cairn had changed again. The stones were rearranged, forming a pattern similar to the symbols on my guitar. My rational mind screamed that someone must be messing with me, but I knew I was alone up here. The ranger's words echoed in my memory. No other campers this week. Too cold still. Morning brought no clarity. I found myself humming the melody while making coffee, my fingers twitching with the need to play. The song was evolving, growing darker, more complex. Like the fog below, it seemed to have a life of its own. Inside my tent, pinned beneath my sleeping bag, I found a scrap of newspaper I hadn't noticed before. The headline made my hands shake. Local musicians missing after Highland camping trip. The date was smudged, but the black and white photo showed 3 faces bright with promise. A folk trio who'd been building a following in local venues. I read the article twice, then a third time, my coffee growing cold beside me. The details were like ice in my veins. 3 singers had disappeared from a campsite, this campsite, after reporting strange music in the valley. They'd been working on new material, according to their families. One of them had called home the night before they vanished, excited about a melody they couldn't get out of their heads. The ranger's words took on new meaning. No other campers this week. Too cold still. How many others had there been? How many had heard the song? I should have packed up right then, should have burned the article and run down the mountain. But as I stared at those 3 faces, the melody in my head seemed to shift, incorporating something that might have been their voices. My fingers itched to touch the guitar strings, to chase that sound. "It's just a coincidence," I said aloud, but my voice sounded thin in the morning air, or someone's idea of a sick joke. Even as I said it, I knew better. The cymbals on my guitar pulsed faintly, like they were responding to my fear. Movement caught my eye. Through the fog below, something shifted. A figure, maybe, or just my imagination. But the melody in my head grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed my guitar, and beneath my trembling fingers, the carved symbols felt warm, almost alive. As I started to play, a sharp gust of wind whipped through my campsite. My notebook fluttered open, and something fell from between its pages, a torn scrap of paper I didn't recognize. My fingers froze on the strings as I read the hastily scrawled note. "James, if you get this, stop. The song isn't yours, it's using you. Look up Stephen Chen, Lisa Reyes, Marcus Price. All wrote the same song, all gone. Don't finish it, don't..." The rest was illegible, but the handwriting was unmistakably Marcus's. The paper felt old, like it had been waiting in my notebook for months. But that was impossible. I'd bought this notebook specifically for this trip. The shadows in the valley were moving again. This time I was sure of it. They were climbing. Night fell too quickly. The fog had reached my campsite, curling around my ankles like hungry cats. I sat cross-legged in my tent, guitar in lap, notebook open. The song was nearly complete. Just a few more measures, a final bridge to tie it all together. It would be my masterpiece. It had to be. The shadows I'd seen in the valley now stood at the edge of my camp. Through the fog, I could make out their forms, twisted things that seemed made of smoke and darkness. Their movements were wrong, like a video played backwards and slowed down. But the melody, God, the melody they carried was perfect. My fingers bled as I played, matching their song note for note. The cymbals on my guitar glowed faintly, the same sickly blue as the cairn, which now pulsed in rhythm with my music. I couldn't stop playing, didn't want to stop. The figures drew closer with each measure. That's when I saw their faces. In the shifting darkness of their forms, I recognized the missing musicians from the article. Their expressions were frozen in eternal ecstasy, mouths open in endless song. Behind them, more figures emerged from the fog, hundreds of them, all singing my song, their song, our song. The cairn shuddered. In the spaces between its stones, I glimpsed something vast and ancient stirring in the void beyond. The truth hit me then. This was never about music. The cairn was a door, and my song was the key. My hands moved toward the final chord. The shadows reached for me with smoky fingers, their touch electric on my skin. The singing built to a crescendo that made my teeth vibrate. One more note and the door would open completely. One more note and I'd have my hit song, and something unspeakable would have our world. I looked down at my guitar, at the glowing cymbals that now covered its entire surface. My life's work, my dreams of success, all of it led to this moment. The shadows pressed closer, their song filling my head, drowning out everything else. But in that last second, I heard another sound cutting through the melody. My own voice, screaming. I smashed the guitar against the cairn. The shadows recoiled as if struck. Again and again I brought the instrument down until it splintered, each impact sending shockwaves through the fog. The cymbals flared brilliantly before going dark. The notebook came next. I tore out the pages and set them alight with my camping stove, watching my masterpiece burn. The screaming was deafening. Not just the figures now, but something else. Something behind the cairn, howling in rage at being denied. The stones began to fall, one by one, then faster, collapsing inward. The shadows withdrew, their forms dissolving like smoke in wind. Their faces, those horrible ecstatic faces, twisted in what might have been relief before fading away. I stood there until dawn, shaking, watching the fog retreat back into the valley. When the sun finally rose, the cairn was just a pile of ordinary rocks. My destroyed guitar lay among them, its wood unmarked, no symbols in sight. Even the newspaper article had vanished, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined it all. But I knew better. The melody still haunted the edges of my mind, trying to work its way back in. I packed quickly, leaving the remains of my guitar behind. As I hurried down the trail, I deleted every music app from my phone, every recording, every note I'd ever written. That was a year ago. I ghosted Marcus and the label, just disappeared completely. Later, I read that he'd signed some promising new artist, who came out of nowhere with an incredible sound. I've listened to their music. There's something familiar in the harmonies that makes my skin crawl. I tried calling Marcus once to warn him, but his assistant said he was on a creative retreat in the Highlands. I haven't tried again. I work at a hardware store now. The owner doesn't ask questions about the bandages I keep on my fingers. It's safer to slice them open than to risk playing when the urge hits. I've learned to live with silence, to avoid even humming. The car radio stays off. I cross the street when I hear street musicians. But the song isn't done with me. Last month, I started noticing things. Small cairns appearing outside my apartment, gone when I look again. Fog rolling in on cloudless days. And the customers, God, the customers. They come into the store humming fragments of that melody, just a few notes, enough to make my blood run cold. Yesterday, It was a young woman with a guitar case. She was singing softly to herself as she browsed the aisles, that same haunting tune. When I rushed to confront her, she was gone, leaving only a faint mist where she'd stood. I've started checking the local music scene blogs. 3 singer-songwriters have gone missing in the past month. Their last known locations form a pattern I don't want to think about. A spiral, drawing closer to my store with each disappearance. Sometimes at night, I swear I can hear their voices joining the chorus in the fog. The song is spreading, growing. The cairns are appearing more frequently now, and not just outside my home. They're everywhere, waiting like dormant spores. And the fog is always thicker these days. I know what you're thinking, that this is just a story, a failed musician's attempt at fiction. I hope you're right. But if you're ever hiking in the highlands and hear singing in the fog, if you see a cairn where there shouldn't be one, don't listen. Don't try to match that melody. Just run. Because the song isn't finished. It's evolving, adapting, using its new voices. And sometimes, late at night, when the fog presses against my windows, I hear Marcus's voice among the chorus, still calling my name, still offering me one last chance at a hit song. Looking back, I should have known better. I mean, I literally teach history for a living. I'm supposed to understand how the past haunts us. But there I was, hiking up that godforsaken trail like some discount Indiana Jones, thinking I'd cracked the case that stumped local historians for over a century. Real genius move there, Paul. The Blackwood Trail disappearances were my obsession that semester. I'd bore my students with fun facts about how 23 settlers vanished without a trace in 1873, watching their eyes glaze over as I rambled about inconsistencies in the official records. But something about those missing pioneers kept gnawing at me. Maybe it was the weird gaps in the investigation, or how quickly the authorities shut down the search. Or maybe I just needed to prove I could solve something bigger than next week's pop quiz. The moment I stepped onto that trail, my chest got tight. You ever get the feeling that you're being watched? Like your skin's trying to crawl right off your bones? The trees were wrong. Ancient oaks and pines grew so dense they choked out the sunlight, their branches twisted together like gnarled fingers. My boots crunched on dead leaves, the sound echoing way longer than it should have. I was checking my GPS, which naturally was going haywire, when I heard someone behind me. Beautiful day for a hike. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The old man seemed to materialize from nowhere, wearing a park ranger uniform that looked wrong. Not dirty or damaged, the opposite. It was pristine, like it had never been touched by wind or rain or time. The fabric moved strangely too, rippling even though there wasn't any breeze. The ranger's smile didn't reach his eyes, and those eyes, I couldn't quite focus on their color. It seemed to shift every time he blinked, like oil on water. A fat droplet of what I assumed was sweat rolled down his temple, but it was too dark, too viscous. Yeah, lovely, I managed, my heart still doing gymnastics. I found myself taking an instinctive step backward, though I couldn't articulate why. I'm actually researching the 1873 disappearances. You wouldn't happen to know anything about... Fascinating choice. He cut me off, still wearing that empty smile. His teeth looked too uniform, like a single piece of white ceramic. Though I'd be careful about digging too deep. Some stories are buried for a reason. My stomach did a slow roll. There was something off about his voice, a subtle echo that seemed to lag milliseconds behind his words, like two people speaking almost, but not quite in sync. What do you mean by that? But he was already walking away, his too-perfect uniform catching the dim light in a way that made it look almost translucent. No, more than that. The fabric seemed to pulse and shift, like something underneath was trying to find its way out. I blinked and he was gone, swallowed by the shadows between the trees. I should have turned back then. Should have listened to that primal part of my brain screaming danger. Instead, I pressed deeper into the woods, trying to match my surroundings to the century-old map I'd found in the county archives. That's when I started noticing the carvings. The first one caught my eye because it was too precise to be natural. 3 parallel lines intersecting with a spiral, carved maybe 3 inches deep into the bark of an ancient oak. My historian's brain immediately tried to categorize it, too geometric for graffiti, too intricate for trailblazes. I pulled out my phone, hands steady as I photographed it, still treating this like any other research project. 20 yards later, I found another. This time it was a series of concentric circles with what looked like teeth marks radiating outward. The cuts were fresh, the exposed wood still pale and unmistakably recent. But the tree itself, the bark had grown around the edges of the symbol, like it had been there for decades, centuries even. They got worse as I continued, each carving more elaborate, more wrong than the last. One looked like a map of human organs rendered in abstract angles. Another seemed to shift and writhe in my peripheral vision, though when I looked directly at it, it was just a static pattern of interlocking triangles. I found myself avoiding touching the trees, irrationally afraid that my fingers might sink right through the bark if they got too close to those symbols. My phone filled with photos as I documented each one, but my hands weren't steady anymore. The carvings formed a clear path deeper into the woods, each one larger and more complex than the last. Some incorporated the natural knots and whorls of the trees, transforming them into eyes or screaming mouths. Others seemed to have been carved from the inside out, the wood splintering outward like something had clawed its way through. What disturbed me most was the progression. It wasn't random. There was a clear evolution in the symbols, like watching a language devolve into madness. The latest ones couldn't even properly be called carvings anymore. They were more like wounds in the trees, seeping a dark sap that smelled of copper and decay. My hands were shaking as I documented them on my phone. The symbols reminded me of something I'd seen in a book about pre-colonial rituals, but that didn't make sense. The official history said this area was uninhabited before the settlers. The air got heavier as I walked, thick with the smell of wet earth and something else, something metallic. My flashlight beam caught something white among the leaves. I knelt down, brushing away the forest debris, and found a piece of bone. Human bone. Not centuries old either. "I told you not to dig!" The ranger's voice came from right behind me. I spun around, scrambling backward, but froze when I saw his face. In the beam of my flashlight, his features seemed to shift and flow like wax. His uniform wasn't fabric at all, but something slick and organic. "The settlers didn't disappear," he said, his voice distorting. "They were given, like the others before them, like the ones who came after." His smile stretched impossibly wide. "Like you!" I ran. My backpack caught on a branch and ripped away, but I clutched my phone like a lifeline. I don't remember most of that panicked sprint through the darkness. I just remember the sounds behind me. Not footsteps, but a wet sliding noise. And the voices. God, the voices. Whispering in a way that I thought would make my ears bleed. Somehow I made it back to my car. Drove straight home with all the lights on and doors locked. Spent the whole night convincing myself it was just panic. Just my imagination running wild. I almost had myself believing it too. When I finally worked up the courage to check my phone, the photos were gone. All of them. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what started happening to my research. Every article I'd collected about the disappearances began changing. Subtle differences at first, dates shifting by a day or two, names spelled slightly wrong, then bigger changes. New witness statements appearing in 100-year-old newspaper clippings, additional names on the list of missing. I thought I was losing my mind until I noticed the pattern. Every new detail, every changed name, was drawing a larger picture. The 1873 disappearances weren't isolated. They were just one point on a much longer timeline. The archives at work started yielding new documents, ones I know weren't there before. Letters from Spanish missionaries dating back to the 1600s, describing the same symbols I saw on those trees. Archaeological surveys from the 1920s that I somehow missed in a decade of research, all leading back to that damn trail. The really sick thing? I'm the only one who sees the changes. I showed my department head a newspaper article about how they found 37 bodies in 1873, not 23. He looked at me like I was crazy. His copy still said 23. But here's what keeps me up at night. In my students' essays, in their test answers, the number keeps growing. A few write 37. Some write 42. Last week, one turned in a paper claiming it was 58. I've stopped teaching the local history unit. Had to. Because now when I look at my lecture notes, I see those symbols in the margins. They grow more complex every time I look away, spreading across my papers like ink in water. And they whisper things, horrible things about what really happened on that trail, about what's still happening. I've tried burning my research, switching to a different historical period, even putting in for a transfer to another school. But the trail, it's like it's written itself into every page of history now. And it's still writing. I know how this ends. That ranger, that thing, he's not just waiting on the trail anymore. I see him in every historical photograph I study, standing in the background, that same pristine uniform, that same ceramic smile. Sometimes he's there in the old class photos hanging in the school hallway. And every year, in the new ones we take, he's standing a little closer to the front. We found the campsite just past noon, when the October sun still held enough warmth to mask the chill creeping up from the river. The clearing shouldn't have been there at all. We'd studied the trail maps thoroughly, and this stretch of forest was supposed to be dense undergrowth all the way to the water. My hiking partner Mike stopped so abruptly I almost crashed into his backpack. Look at that setup. The site was perfect. Too perfect. A neat circle of camp chairs surrounded a fire pit that still had wisps of smoke rising from fresh ashes. A metal pot sat on a flat rock beside it, steam curling from whatever was inside. Someone's hiking boots, expensive ones, stood neatly paired beside one of the chairs. I pulled out my phone to check the map again. We're at least 6 miles from the nearest designated camping area. Mike prodded the pot with a stick. Still warm. They must have just gone for a hike. Without their boots? He shrugged, dropping his pack beside one of the chairs. Maybe they had spare shoes. We've been walking for hours. Might as well take advantage. Something about the scene felt wrong, like walking into a stranger's house and finding dinner on the table. But my feet ached, and the chairs looked inviting. We set up our tent a respectful distance from the existing camp, though no amount of scanning the trees revealed any other equipment or signs of occupancy. As twilight crept in, the woods grew quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects. Even the river's constant murmur seemed muted, as if the water itself was holding its breath. Mike poked at our own fire. They should have been back by now. The words hung in the air like smoke. I pulled my jacket tighter and checked my phone again. No signal, of course. The screen reflected my face, and behind it, something moved in the tree line. I whirled around. Nothing but shadows. Did you see that? Mike shook his head, but his hands trembled as he added another log to the fire. The rustling started around midnight. It came from all directions at once. Not the familiar scurrying of small animals, but something larger, something that seemed to circle our camp with deliberate slowness. Each time we turned toward the sound, it stopped, only to resume behind us. Mike grabbed my arm. There's someone out there. I played my flashlight beam across the trees. The light caught something that might have been eyes, might have been dewdrops, might have been my imagination. They vanished before I could be sure. Neither of us slept. We kept the fire blazing until dawn, when exhaustion finally overtook fear. I must have dozed for minutes or hours. I'm still not sure. When I opened my eyes, the other camp was gone. The chairs had vanished. The pot, the boots. Even the second fire pit had disappeared, leaving undisturbed earth where I knew there had been ashes. I took out my phone again, hands shaking. Even with no signal, I could still access my camera roll. Mike, wake up! He jolted awake, instantly alert. What's wrong? I want to prove we're not crazy. I opened the photos from yesterday, already knowing what I'd find. The clearing was there, but something was wrong with every shot. In one, the chairs appeared as blurry shadows, like heat waves rising from asphalt. In another, the fire pit showed up as a dark smudge that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. The boots were nowhere to be seen. That's not right, Mike muttered, grabbing the phone. I took a specific picture of that pot because I thought the design was weird. He scrolled frantically through his own photos. It was right here, I swear. I remember taking it. But when he showed me his screen, the photo wasn't of a pot at all. It was just a close-up of disturbed earth, with something that might have been a handprint pressed into the soil. Or maybe it was just a shadow. We broke camp in record time, leaving behind anything we couldn't stuff into our packs in 30 seconds. As I rolled up my sleeping bag, I noticed dark smudges on my hands. Not dirt, but something like old ash that wouldn't wipe off. Mike had them too. The 6-mile hike back to the ranger station passed in a blur of paranoid glances and startled jumps at every snapping twig. The ranger was young, probably fresh out of training. He looked up from his computer as we burst in. "You folks okay?" I slapped my phone on his desk, showing him the photos. There was a campsite in the clearing by the river, then it vanished. The blood drained from his face. "That's not possible." "We saw it," Mike insisted. "Chairs, fire pit, everything." The ranger's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. "That clearing's been closed for decades. There was a fire in '82, killed a whole group of campers. Family reunion." He paused, glancing at my driver's license on his desk where I'd left it during check-in. His eyes widened. "Wait, Thompson? Any relation to Robert Thompson?" I felt the floor tilt beneath me. My uncle. Holy shit. He ran a hand through his hair. "They still use that case in training. Your uncle wasn't part of the '82 group. He vanished there 3 years later. After that, they banned camping within a mile of that clearing entirely. Started requiring 2 ranger signatures to even approve trail maintenance in that area." He shook his head. "I've seen the case files. They never found a trace." My hands were already moving, zooming in on one of the photos, the one I'd taken of our fire late last night. In the embers, shapes began to emerge, faces, a dozen or more, mouths open in silent screams. And there, in the center, I dropped the phone like it had burned me. "What?" Mike grabbed for it. "That's my Uncle Robert." The words came out barely above a whisper. My hands had gone numb, and somewhere far away, I could hear Mike asking if I was okay. I hadn't thought about Uncle Robert in years. Mom never talked about him after he vanished, just packed away the photos and changed the subject whenever his name came up. I was only 6 when he disappeared, but I remembered how she'd cry at night, how she kept calling the rangers for months afterward. "He went camping," she'd tell people who asked. "He went camping and never came back." The ranger reached for my phone, but I was already backing away, my mind racing through childhood memories. The hushed conversations between my parents, the way Dad had nightmares for weeks after helping with the search parties, the box in Mom's closet labeled Robert Camping Gear that she never opened. I turned and ran for my car. I had to get home, had to check the old family albums, had to know if that family reunion 40 years ago. I'm looking at those albums now. The photos are spread across my kitchen table, yellow with age. And there it is, the last picture ever taken of Uncle Robert. He's sitting in a camp chair, next to a fire pit, in a clearing by a river. Behind him, just visible in the growing dusk, stands a circle of empty chairs. The fire in the pit is strange, though. The longer I stare at the flames, the more faces I see emerging from the embers. And one of them looks exactly like me. Not as I am now, but as I will be. Older, maybe, hollow-eyed and screaming like all the others. I've been sitting here for hours, watching the sun set through my kitchen window. I should call Mom. Should tell her I finally know what happened to Uncle Robert. But my phone is still in my hand, and I can't stop staring at that last photo from the clearing. The faces in our campfire are clearer now. I can make out every detail, every tortured expression, and I'm starting to recognize others. Mike is there too, though he doesn't know it yet. The thing is, I understand now why those chairs were empty when we found them. Their occupants were already in the fire, waiting. Just like they're waiting in every fire, in every clearing, in every forest where people disappear. I've packed my camping gear in a box and labeled it with my name. Someday someone will find it and wonder why I never came back. But we don't really leave, do we? We just join the circle. I wonder if Uncle Robert tried to warn anyone. I wonder if he knew what was coming when he sat in that chair. I wonder if I'll know when it's my turn. The sun has set now. Through my window, I can see my neighbor's fire pit glowing in their backyard, and in the embers, something moves.